Hello, and welcome to the GitHub Fundamentals Workshop. In this workshop, I'll be teaching you how to use GitHub, a version control system that allows you to work on large projects with multiple team members without any one person's changes to files getting swept under the rug. To be more specific, GitHub is a hosting platform that stores your code and other files in repositories that let you and others work together from anywhere. These repositories are created and managed through a program called Git, which is a version control system for tracking changes in source code during software development. Now, why do we use GitHub or any other sort of version control? Well, GitHub allows us to branch, merge, and fork our projects. Branching basically lets us make a new copy of our project that we can then edit or assign someone else to edit without the main version being affected. Merging lets us take these branches and combine them back into the main version of the project after settling any conflicts. And forking allows people outside our project to make copies of our project that they can make changes to and propose for merging with the original. These functionalities have made GitHub a staple in the software development industry. So much so that recruiters may spend more time looking at your GitHub projects than they will your resume. Without further ado, let's get into it. The first thing we want to do is to open up a web browser and visit www.github.com. Here you'll be prompted to make an account. So go ahead and fill in the information here, click sign up, verify your account, and complete the setup that follows afterward. Once you've verified your email, you should end up here. And before we do anything else, we're going to need to make a new tab and go to desktop.github.com. This is going to take us to the download page for the GitHub Desktop app. We'll be using this to manage our repository. We'll click the download button and then wait for the download. We'll then open up that file so that we can complete the setup. When GitHub asks you what you would like to do first, you'll want to click Create a Repository on the left. Otherwise, you can click on the plus button in the top right corner and select New Repository from the drop-down option. First, you'll need to give your repository a name. I'll name mine something like FW Git Shop. You can also give it a description, like a demo repo for teaching GitHub. Next, you'll have to choose whether the repository will be public or private. This is only changing who can see the repository, not who can commit or edit it. After that, we have the final step, which is to choose what we want to initialize the repository with. There's the README file, the git ignore, and licensing. We're going to check the box for the README file, which I'll explain the importance of in a second. Git ignore essentially tells your repository what files to ignore changes to when committing your changes, which can be really useful, but not at this moment. Connecting a license will help set the guidelines for how your project will be used, but we're not going to be using that here. You can check out choosealicense.com for details on the different kinds of licenses that can be used. Once you've selected what you want, you can click on Create Repository. We've now created our first repository, which will include all of the files for our project. Here's where we would normally see all of our files, but currently we only have the README file we selected earlier. Now, a good README file is one of the most important pieces of any project. A good README file is a text document that describes how to help develop and use the project. It also serves as the face of the project, seeing as it's the first file that anyone opens when visiting your project. I'm going to click on the pencil button here to edit this README file and then go through some of the most basic info that you might want to include in your README. We have title, which should be the name of the project. Programs, which is a list of the programs either used to make the project or the project is made for. Function, which explains what the project is and what it's for. How to use, which teaches users how to use your project. You can possibly put a step-by-step guide in here. And finally, how to contribute. which explains how users contribute to your project, if they can at all. These are just some of the basics, but your README file should grow as your project grows. So now that we have a good understanding of the README file, let me show you how to use the desktop app to make changes to this repository. Okay, so I've switched back over to the desktop app and I signed into my GitHub account. If you're unsure of how to do that, you can go to File, Options, and in the Accounts tab, you should be able to sign in. Once you've signed in, you should be able to select the repository that you just made and click Clone. Cloning the repository means that you are making a copy of the project onto your local machine. When the cloning prompt pops up, you don't want to touch the repository URL, seeing as this will be autofilled with our repo's link. The local path you can change. That's going to be where you want the repo to be stored on your device. And then we just click Clone. It should only take a second, seeing as we only have a README file and haven't committed any changes. After the cloning is finished, you'll be taken to the repository manager. Up in the top left, we can see the current repository that we're working with. You can click on the drop-down to add new ones or change the current one you're working on. Below that, we have two tabs, Changes and History. Changes is going to be a list of all the changes that we have made to the project that haven't been committed. Once the changes are committed to the repo, they'll both be the same, and so it won't show up as different. Let's make a small change to our repo as a demonstration. I'm going to open up my repository's file location by selecting Repository at the very top of the window, and then Show in Explorer since I'm on Windows. And this will pull up where my repository is. Then we're just going to add a text file by right-clicking and selecting New Text Document. And I'll rename it Test Changes. Now, if we return to the desktop app, you should see now that there have been changes made that make my local version different from the one I originally cloned. You can see that testchanges.txt has a green plus icon. This icon means that something has been added that is new. Yellow usually means that you've modified something, and red is when something has been removed. Our second tab, History, shows us a list of all the commits that have been made to the repository. If your changes are not committed and pushed to the remote repository, then GitHub's version of the project is not going to have those changes. For instance, I didn't commit the changes I made to the README file earlier, meaning that if I go and open it up, those changes aren't going to be there. So how do we commit our changes then? Well, if we go back to our Changes tab, you can see that at the bottom of this column, we can commit from here. We need to give the commit a name, and then we can describe it if we would like to. Then we just click the Commit to Main. Then if we switch to our History tab, we can see our new commit is listed there. But even though we have committed the changes on our local repository, these commits aren't going to show up on GitHub. If we pull up the repository's webpage, you can see that it doesn't have test changes. So what we need to do is something called pushing, which is where we can push our changes up into the remote repository that is GitHub. We can do this by clicking on the Push Origin button near the top of the window. Now we can head back to the repo webpage, refresh, and the file's there. So you now know how to keep your GitHub repository updated with the changes you're making on your local version. But if there are multiple people working on your project, they're going to be pushing their changes to GitHub as well. And our local repository isn't going to automatically import all their changes to our local version. So if we want to make sure that we have all the most recent changes, we need to do the opposite of pushing, which is pooling. So to pull down any changes to our local machine, we need to click on the Fetch Origin to check if there are any changes to be pulled. Currently, there are no other contributors to my project. Of course, there aren't going to be any other changes. Now you may have noticed earlier, but when we were committing our changes, we were committing to main. Now what is main? Well, main is the current branch of the repository that we are on. Think of branches as ways to split off your project into separate versions. You only start with the main branch, which is basically the trunk of the tree, and you can add on as many new branches as you like. So why would we want to make separate branches? Well, it's really the same reason why we have a Save button and a Save As button on most document editors. You're not going to always want to commit your changes to your main version of your project. If we're making changes that could break our project, it's much safer to commit those in a separate branch for testing. To make a new branch, we can just click on the Current Branch dropdown and click on the New Branch button. Then we just have to give it a name and click on Create Branch. And now we're good to go. Now any changes we make will only be committed to this branch. And when we push it for the first time, it'll publish the branch and add it onto our GitHub webpage. If I refresh, I can click here and see that we also have the testing branch. Now, I've just made some changes to my testing branch, and let's say that we made all the changes that we sought to make in this branch and everything is working correctly. We would now want our main branch to have the changes that we've made to this one. How do we do this? What you'll need to do is merge the branches. We can do this in the desktop app by selecting the Current Branch drop-down menu, switching over to the branch that you want to merge the changes over into. For me, it'll be main. Then reopen that drop-down menu and select the Choose a Branch to Merge Into button at the bottom. You can then select the branch you want to take the changes from. I'll click Testing, and then click the Merge button on the bottom. Now hopefully this will be all you need to do to merge most of your branches, but sometimes you'll run into situations where changes were made from one branch and they conflict with changes made in the other. When this happens, you'll have to resolve the conflict by choosing what changes get to stay and which don't. You'll be given a choice in what tool you would like to resolve the conflict with. Or if you don't have one, you can resolve it manually. Manually resolve a conflict, you'll close the pop-up window with the X in the top right, and then deselect the files that are causing conflicts to not include them in the merge. After you've made the appropriate changes, you can commit them to the branch. Next up, let's go over some of the repository settings that you can adjust on the GitHub website. You can reach these settings on your repository page by clicking on the settings in the top section of the window. We'll only be covering the most important settings for those just starting, but feel free to explore all the available options GitHub has to offer. In the Option tab, we can rename our repository, toggle different features, enable GitHub Pages, and at the very bottom we can change the visibility of our repo, transfer ownership of the repo, archive the repo, or delete the repo. In the Branches tab, you can change your default branch to any of your other existing branches and define rules that relate to your branches. In the Webhooks tab, you can add webhooks and manage the events that will send payloads to the configured URL. In the Notifications tab, you can add a couple of email addresses that will be sent messages every time something is pushed on the repo. In the Integrations tab, you'll manage any GitHub apps that you're using. The most important Settings tab is going to be the Manage Access tab. This is where you'll be able to add collaborators to your project. To add a collaborator, just click on Invite a Collaborator, search the user's name, and click on the correct search result. Then finally, click Add to this repository. They should get an email letting them know that they've been invited to the repository. You can also delete your invitations from here and revoke access to the repository. Now that we've learned a little more about managing our own repository, let's take a look at someone else's repo. If you're interested in someone else's public GitHub repository, you could always clone it, but this leaves you unable to push any changes that you make to it. This is where forking comes in. Forking allows you to create your own personal copy of someone else's repository. You can then push your own changes or even make a pull request, which is when you ask for someone to review your changes and pull them into a branch. To fork a repository, simply visit that repository's page and then click the fork button in the top right area of the window. It should then automatically start creating your own copy of the repository. And boom, you're done. You've created your own version of the repository. You'll see in the top left that it's created your own version of that repository. So you now know the basics of managing a GitHub repository and how to make changes to it through the GitHub Desktop app. The GitHub Desktop app makes it super simple to use Git commands, but there may come a time where you'll need to enter Git commands directly. To wrap up this workshop, I'm going to show you how to complete some of the same functions we used in the desktop app from the command line to help ease that transition should you need to make it. First off, in our desktop app, we're going to go to Repository, and then Open in command line. Now it's going to tell us that it is unable to locate Git. So even though the GitHub Desktop app is actually performing Git functions, it doesn't mean that you have Git installed and ready for command line usage. So we'll select the Install Git button. It should then open up a new page in your web browser that goes over how to set up Git. We'll first need to click on Download and install the latest version of Git. I'd recommend opening it in a new tab by right-clicking and selecting Open Link in a new tab option. You'll then want to switch over to that tab and click the Download button for your device type. Once the download is finished, you'll want to open that up to get to this point. It's going to give you some important information about their public license, and once you've reviewed it, you can click Next. Then select where you would like Git to be stored. You can see here that it requires 257.9 megabytes of space for me. Then just click Next again. You'll then be able to select which components you would like to install. I'm going to keep it like this and just click Next. Then going to ask about Start Menu Shortcut Location. If you don't want this, you can check the box here, then click Next. You'll then want to choose your default code editor from the drop-down, then click Next again. The next option relates to default branch names, but only if you're creating a repository through Git. Earlier in the lesson, I taught you how to create a repository on GitHub and clone it on your local machine. But it's also possible to do it the other way around, where you start the repository on your local machine and then push it up to GitHub. For now, I'm going to leave this as is and click Next, since I'll be making my repositories on GitHub. For all of the following sections, I'm going to leave them as is, but you can feel free to read through them and make changes if you like. This includes path environment, transport backend, the line ending conversions, terminal emulator, Git pool, credential helper, extra options, and experimental options. And then I'll just click Install. Once it's finished, you can check Launch Git Bash and uncheck View Release Notes, and then click Finish. Once it opens, we'll need to set up our username. So we'll type in git -config --global -user .name, and then in quotations, whatever you would like your username to be. and then just hit enter. Now to check it and see if that is correct, we can use git space config space -- global space user.name, and then just hit enter. It should print the name that you typed in. Then we'll need to connect to our GitHub account via the email connected to our account. For this, we'll type in git space config space -- global space user.email. And then this time in the quotes, we're going to put whatever email is connected to our account. And then hit enter. And to check that, it'll be super similar. It's going to be git space config space -- global space user.email. And there we go. Now head back over to the desktop app, and we're going to go to File, and then Options. We're then going to select Integrations on the left, and under the word Shell, we're going to select Git Bash from the dropdown. If it's not there immediately, don't worry, just restart your GitHub Desktop app, then we'll click Save. Now we're really finally ready to try this again. We'll go to Repository, and then select Open in Git Bash. I'm going to open a new window of Git Bash that is now connected to our repository's main branch. To push changes to GitHub, you'll use the git push command. It looks like this: git space push space the remote, which will be origin, and the branch name, which is main. And then hit enter. It's then going to have us sign into GitHub to check our authorizations. I'll click Sign In with your browser. You'll want to authorize Git Credential Manager. Then you can close the page, and you should see that it's pushed successfully. To pull changes from GitHub, you'll use the git pull command. Looks just like git push, but with pull. So git space pull space origin space main, and then I'll click enter. It says that it's already up to date. If we wanted to work on a different branch of the repository, we need to check out that branch. You can do this with the checkout command. First, you should check the current branch you're using with the command git space branch. So it'll show us the branch that we're currently on. Then we'll use git checkout, git space checkout, and then the branch name. For me, my extra branch is testing. And then hit enter. Then we can just use git branch again to check and make sure we successfully switched over to the other branch. Now any changes we make will be applied to that branch. These are just some of the basics when using Git with your GitHub projects. And there are a lot more commands that you can learn about that will give you more complexity that can be achieved on the desktop app. That being said, the GitHub Desktop app makes using the most common features of Git much more user-friendly. Either way, you now know the basics of setting up and managing a repository that you and your contributors can use to keep your project files up to date.